Hi, everyone. Welcome to our preview on secondary sources. As you can tell, we spent several weeks now really diving deep into learning about the two first and key primary sources, that is, case law and statutory research. But before we move on to our third and final primary source, which is administrative agency law, I wanted to take a detour and go over secondary sources. Because in case you couldn't tell so far, learning about primary research is complicated. It's not easy to locate cases and statutes, and it can be even more challenging to read those cases and statutes once you find them. And so that is why in the law library, we have a huge body of secondary sources. So the first thing I just want to remind everybody of is that when we talk about going into the law library, whether physical or virtual, there are a lot of books and resources at our fingertips. And every source that is written by the government, remember, those are our primary sources. So those are the cases and the statutes. You're reading the words of the judges and of the legislature. But there's a whole body of other sources waiting for us in the law library that are not written by the government. They're written by lawyers and judges. And we call that entire universe of sources secondary sources. So what I'm going to go through in this preview video is talk a little bit about why we use secondary sources and introduce you to some of the leading secondary sources. There are so many that there is no way we'd be able to go through all of them in class, but I want to show you what types there are and how to use them because they're all a little bit similar in how they're organized. Just remember, anytime you're using a source other than the case itself, the statute, or the administrative regulation, if you're using any other source, that is a secondary source. So that would include dictionaries, legal encyclopedias we will talk about. There are law journals, newspapers, law review articles. We're going to go through quite a few of these. So why do we use them? Why do we even have secondary sources if we've just told you that you could go research the cases or the statutes yourself? Well, again, you may remember my analogy from earlier this semester, and maybe your experience now is similar. It's really difficult to read court cases. It's difficult to find court cases. It's not like we can just say, hey, Westlaw or hey, Law Library, can you just give me all the cases on slipping and falling on snow and ice in the winter? It doesn't work that way. It's really complicated. And so we use secondary sources really for two reasons. Number one, the secondary sources really help explain to us the law that we're researching. And I'm not going to say in super plain English, but as close to plain English as possible. And different secondary sources will be better than this at others. But the way a judge or a lawyer could write about the legal issue, summarizing several cases at once, can really help us understand what we're researching. Personally, I highly recommend secondary sources anytime you're researching a new topic, because that's even more complicated, something you've maybe never heard of before, or maybe you heard about it, but you're just not that familiar with it. Why not read a secondary source first to help you understand the legal issue? Even if it's not a new issue to you, if there's a development in the law, secondary sources are our friends. The other reason to use secondary sources is that it actually helps us with our research. Because the secondary sources, in order to describe and summarize an area of law, rely on the primary sources. And the secondary source will give us citations to those primary sources, either in the body of the paragraph or chapter you're reading. You might get the citations right there in the paragraph, or you will have extensive footnotes or endnotes listing all the primary sources. So that's a really huge research help. Remember, when you go to court and you present the argument to the judge, we generally don't rely on a lot of secondary sources, although we'll talk about some circumstances where it is appropriate to rely on secondary sources. But because the primary sources include cases and statutes, and therefore are the mandatory authority, we want to get to those cases and statutes. And one way to get to them and find those and find those mandatory cases is to actually start with secondary sources and read the description of the law and then look at the citations that the secondary source relied on. Go look up those cases and then read those cases and then use all those other tools that we've talked about, using the headnote system, using key citing, using that one good case theory in order to find more cases, just like the ones cited in a secondary source. So don't think of this as a step back. Don't think of this as like, oh, remember in high school if somebody used Cliff's Notes to write the report? It's not quite like that. It's better than that. All attorneys use secondary sources. Many of them are incredibly reputable. If you're looking at the Harvard Law Review, that's not too shabby. But just word to the wise, of course, we're not writing all of our briefs just based on secondary sources. All right, so let me go through some of the leading secondary sources. So Black's Law Dictionary, I think I've mentioned in class, having a legal dictionary is a secondary source because it helps you understand the words of the primary source, and it's not written by the government itself. I highly recommend using a legal dictionary. Black's Law Dictionary is the leading one. What about legal encyclopedias? Some of you, and I'll say this nicely, especially those of you who are of my generation, might remember using World Book Encyclopedia or Encyclopedia Britannica when we were kids or younger to do a lot of assignments. And we have legal encyclopedias in the law. The two that are well known are called American Jurisprudence Second, that's called AMGER, and Corpus Juris Secundum, that's known as CJS. We will be looking at AMGER because that is the one that is in Westlaw. Attorneys also rely on law review articles. Every single law school around the country publishes journals that come out usually quarterly or maybe 3 times a year. And these law journals are written mostly by professors from that school or other schools, and they publish scholarly articles on areas of law. Most practicing attorneys don't read law review articles on a day-to-day basis, but there are some issues that are well explored in law review articles. Treatises is a group of books that cover every single multitude of topics, but are usually focused on a particular topic. So this will be a little bit different than the legal encyclopedia. Remember, if you know Encyclopedia Britannica or World Book, or even if you're familiar with Wikipedia, encyclopedias cover every single topic, and legal encyclopedias do the same. Treatises are usually focused on one topic, and there's some really well-known treatises. For example, there's a treatise on bankruptcy law, evidence law, practicing in the federal courts, family law. So if you end up working in a specialized area of law, you may find yourself using the treatise that is known in that area of law. I also will briefly mention something called American Law Reports. And lastly, practice manuals. There are a lot of forms available in different secondary sources. So if you have to write a motion or complete a form for, let's say, the housing court or the bankruptcy court, there's a lot of sample documents out there. No need to reinvent the wheel and guess what the form should say. You should look at practice manuals that give us a lot of assistance. All right, let me go through a couple of these leading ones because I want to show you some stuff. Hate that word. All right, AMGER is a legal encyclopedia. This and CJS are the two that everybody uses. So if you're familiar with encyclopedias, they are organized alphabetically by topic. Why do we go to encyclopedia anyway? Because an encyclopedia will give us a summary of some area of information that we don't know a lot about. And that is exactly what the legal encyclopedia does. It organizes for us summaries of literally every area of law alphabetically by topic. So talk about something easier to use because it's already organized in a more user-friendly fashion. Now, just like we talked about with the digest system, every broad topic can also be broken down into subtopics, and AMGER does that for us as well. But AMGER is a wonderful resource because it's written in as probably close to plain English as you'll find. This is the source to go to if you are given a topic that is completely brand new and unknown to you, especially if you've never even heard the word before, I would recommend going to the Black's Law Dictionary or a legal dictionary first, and then to AMGER. The other reason AMGER is really nice is that it gives you footnotes to cases where that law comes from. Now, something important to keep in mind, if it's not obvious already, is that it's called American jurisprudence second. It's not called Massachusetts jurisprudence. So AMGER covers really all the areas of law for the entire United States. And what's overwhelming about that is that you might find citations to Alaska cases, New Mexico cases, and you might be thinking, oh my goodness, that's not really helpful. And the reason you'll find cases from different jurisdictions is because AMGER summarizes the law really nationwide. And because it does that, each section only gives you a handful of cases. So you might read an entire section and not see a citation to American law. To Massachusetts law. And that can be frustrating. But don't worry, because we will talk about how you can find even a case in AMGER from, let's say, New Mexico, and use that to find a case example in Massachusetts. Remember, the hint is the headnote system. So I'm going to definitely run out of time on this PowerPoint presentation, but I want you to see on Westlaw, I'm going to show you in class next week how to use the table of contents and the index for Westlaw. It has an index. We're also going to talk in class a little bit about American law reports. It's pretty much the opposite of AMGER because it literally it will list every single case in every jurisdiction for all time on a particular topic. So it's a gold mine of cases, unlike AMGER, which actually doesn't have every single case listed. So it's a different way to research primary law. It's not as user-friendly, but it can be very useful. So we're going to go over AMGER. We're going to go over American law reports. And last, but certainly not least, we're going to talk about my favorite secondary source. And if you work in Massachusetts, the one you will use the most, which is Massachusetts Practice Series. Massachusetts Practice Series is not exactly an encyclopedia, but it operates similar to one. It summarizes all the basic law in Massachusetts. When I moved to Massachusetts after practicing law in DC for 2 years, this was my best friend and continued to be my best friend because it summarizes in plain English Massachusetts law. It has citations to all of our primary law. So unlike AMGER, which is going to give you citations to different states' laws in addition to Massachusetts, Mass Practice Series will bring you right to Massachusetts cases and statutes. There's also wonderful form books. So if you're looking to complete forms in Massachusetts, Mass Practice Series is really useful for that as well. It is also organized by subject matter. So we're going to spend our class time really focused on AMGER, Mass Practice Series, and a little bit on American law reports, because otherwise I will be overwhelmed. But I'm going to show you where you'll be overwhelmed too. I'll show you where others of these exist on Westlaw, and I'll encourage you to look around. The one that is actually very well used in Massachusetts that we don't have access to on Westlaw is the Massachusetts Continuing Legal Education Books, MCLE. That is our continuing education organization. They have a number of classes for attorneys and paralegals on all areas of Massachusetts law, and they publish a lot of books. Unfortunately, Westlaw doesn't give us access to MCLE, but you will probably see it and use it in your practice as well. So something else we'll talk about with secondary sources, in addition to how to use them, is when to use them. We don't often cite secondary sources. Again, we're always looking for those primary sources, but there are some examples where you might need to or want to cite to a secondary source to help make your case. So that's a little bit of an overview. We will definitely be using Westlaw. I'll talk a little bit more in class, and then similar to cases and statutes, we'll do some in-class exercises as well. Hope that has been helpful, and I will see you all next week.